5 minutes. Mary Kay said I had like 25. That's not my speech. Come back with that. My name's Tom Martin, and I'm the youngest of Paul's 3 sons. Andy Martin sitting over there, and he came first. Where's Neil Martin? Has anybody seen Neil? But anyway, I just kind of wanted to go back into the family history time just a little bit to share the stories that you've all heard, but just in different ways. You know, Paul brought some wonderful women into our lives, and before we were introduced to Mary Kay, it was Mary Ann. And Paul and Mary Ann came to Tucson in 1857 when I was that little baby in swaddling cloth that Ray Turner met. And Paul immediately said, go forth and explore. You all know that. But, you know, exploration typically was wrought with terror, whether it was, you know, the muffler falling off the truck, or it was the day when my 2 elder brothers came walking up the driveway holding hands. Isn't that cute? Oh, look, they're carrying something precious. That's neat. They're kind of walking sideways. Why are they doing that? And they're all holding hands together. That's curious. All 4 hands in one little precious item. Oh, yeah, it's a cactus. So, you know, adult 1 grabs child 1, adult 2 grabs child 2, and they back up. That was the exploration of our lives. The sheer terror that we brought home. Seems like once a month or more frequently, and I always thought it was a good thing that our parents were so involved in peaceful things, you know, the peace movement and trying to get the missiles out of the silos and that kind of stuff, because we brought holy terror home. They needed that touchstone to peace, to lose, you know, not lose their sanity. Another sort of journey into explorations that we used to play, which I really liked, because with 2 elder brothers a couple years older, there were very few games I could ever play and win. But one of them was what I called the blind driver game. And the drivers weren't blind, but we were. We had a little Nash Rambler, 2-door, big back seat with big footwell. And we kids would get in that footwell in the back seat. You couldn't peek, you had to stay down there. Mom and Dad would hop in the front, and we'd cruise on down the driveway, and you knew when you got up on the road out of the driveway, but did we turn right or left? And then where did we go, and did we turn right or left? And after a while, you know, Paul's doing easy circles in the car, you know, trying to confuse us. And eventually the car would stop, and the youngest kid would get out until there was no one left in the car. So, being youngest kid, I'd get out first. The door would close, there would go the car. And I look around. The game was the first kid home won. So being the youngest, I got let out closest to home. And if I booked it, I could get home first. I could win the game. I could win. So I asked Paul many years later, I said, what were you doing? You and Mary Ann hop in the car, drive home. Uh-huh. Where are the kiddies? They're scattered out in the middle of nowhere. What were you doing? He said we were sitting at the kitchen table. Not quite what I was thinking. We were sitting at the kitchen table wondering how we were going to answer 2 questions. Question number 1 was what we were going to tell the sheriff when he brought you home. Question number 2 was what we were going to tell the sheriff if you didn't come home. So this journey into explorations was certainly, I think, something that all of you are sharing. And so I have a challenge to you all, which I was going to bring up first, but I don't have my notes because you took them. There have been a ton of wonderful Paul Martin stories. Please type up your favorite story in an email and mail it to Mary Kay. I know where this is going. But it wasn't just exploration. Another story toward the end, when the family was sort of splintering in many different ways, and Paul had bought the house down in downtown. I had a pink Harley. We all knew how to really piss off our parents. We were good at this. Any of you that have children, you understand kids are good at that. How do they figure that out? So I'm cruising my Harley one day, and there's something in the road, and I sweep down and I scoop it up, and it's a purse. So now I'm driving a Harley with a purse. And I get home, and I open up the purse, and I look in there, and there's a driver's license. So I call the number, and this person answers the phone and says, "Oh, you found my purse. Awesome. Hey, look in there and see if there's like $1,000 worth of cash." Yeah, it's in here. And they're like, "Okay, where are you?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, I'm here. Come get me in." And so they came, they knocked on the door. I gave them the purse. They were very happy to give me a $20 bill. I'm like, "Cool, $20. This is great. That was easy." And Paul came home later that day, and I told him the story, and kind of looked at me. Thought he was going to be happy. Kind of looked at me, and he said, "So the desire to do something good is a good thing. But what was your motivation in taking the $20? I thought about that for a long time, and I think that's how Paul... Hey, it's working. I don't have to shout anymore. Thank you. I think that's how Paul kind of journeyed through his career, a landmine career. I mean, really, really full of problems. But if your motives were clear, you could have that 20-year debate. And eventually, people wouldn't come around to see your point of view because you wore them down. People would come around to see your point of view because eventually literature caught up with you and you were right.
I was one of Paul's grad students in palynology, one of his early ones. Paul Martin applied an old methodology, was developed about 1900 in Scandinavia and Eastern North America, called palynology. And he applied it to the American Southwest in a way no one really had thought about since Paul Sears looked at palynology in the Southwest in 1937 with some work with Ernst Antevs up in the northern part of Arizona. Paul turned to pollen analysis shortly after graduate school because he was a zoologist, and his interests were northern Mexico and herps, trying to understand why some of these animals that are more widespread in Mexico just barely get into the United States, and then why they were isolated on mountaintops. How do you have animals on mountaintops? How do they get there? And so, with the advice of Ed Deavy from Yale, Paul started to delve into palynology as a way to understand this, the paleoecology. It just shows, as many speakers have said, his wide range of interests and how that he was able to move in a lot of different directions. Paul showed things that we never even thought about early on: dry lake beds, playas, floodplains, arroyo deposits, alluvium contained abundant pollen. And while it was discontinuous records, if you looked at enough of them, they started to make sense, and they started to fall into a continuous column. A lot of people doubted his work early on. At that time, when he first started here, I was a graduate student at the University of New Mexico, and I remember my professor over there was very skeptical of what Paul was doing, because my professor basically saw the problems, and he wasn't seeing the potential out of it. But Paul kept working on these. So many of these sites showed they really did match up, and they correlated across a wide area. In the process of doing this, he upset a lot of cherished notions that a lot of us had over the years, forcing us to rethink what we were doing and looking at it differently. Such simple things as he was one of the first ones to show that the heavy periods of erosion in the West were actually caused when the climate was more moist, rather than the drier climates that we had sort of been trained in our early geology courses. Paul brought information that the zoologists, the botanists, the archaeologists, the geologists, anthropologists could use. He tied all of these disciplines together, as people have been saying, in a way that just made it so much easier for us to move back and forth. One of the fun things about this hill was I came up here when it was still the laboratory of geochronology. Basically, it took anybody, if you had a basic grounding in science, as long as you were in biology, geology, or anthropology. So we had this wide range of students up here with a lot of different backgrounds, and we really had a very big free-flowing ideas, as people have talked about. Lunches on this patio all the time. This hill, in those early pollen years, was just a powerhouse of activity. For those of you that were up here, it was just the most incredible place. I've discussed my graduate school experiences with people all over the country. I very rarely find anybody else that had an experience that we had up here. Just constant interchange with people. The visiting professors, scientists from all over the world would wander through here. Sometimes they'd stay a week or two, sometimes it'd be for the day. Always sitting out here at lunch, running down the bottom of the hill, getting a sandwich, racing back up here, and just continuing to talk about pollen, paleoecology, and those things. This was a real powerhouse up on here. The pollen work here is now quiet. The hill has sort of moved to a more quiescent phase now. But the ideas that Paul generated up here are still reverberating around the country and still with a lot of us. It continues on what he did, started here. He had a can-do attitude that I especially appreciated. He never said you couldn't do it. Just go out and try it. You know, you might stumble, but that's okay. That's part of the learning process. In my own dissertation, he decided at one point I needed to write a very lengthy chapter, which I did, on mastodon extinction. I was working in Missouri at the time, and I really it was an very ancillary part of my dissertation. So he had me write this long chapter, which I did do. He was very happy with it. So I showed it to Pete Maringer, who was on my committee. Pete said, "What the hell is this doing in your dissertation?" And I said, "Paul wanted me to write it." Pete said, "Okay, put it in the file." So I told Paul, and Paul said, "That's good. I just wanted you to explore those things." So, fortunately, about 10 years later, that paper became a published paper with Geoff Saunders, who's back here. The germ of that ended up later, but that was Paul. Just wanted me to explore an idea that was sort of very ancillary to what I was trying to do. And he was happy I did it, even though Pete said, "Get it out of your dissertation." It was always lively up here. You know, it was fun. The pollen period, you might call it, or the pollen work with Paul, really led to a lot of his other stuff, which you all know, the Packrat work, and a lot of these other things started to spin off from his pollen work. And then it really reached the apex. I sort of think of the apex of his pollen work probably was his 1963 book, The Last 10,000 Years. That thing was just so phenomenal. That came out when I was just finishing my master's at New Mexico, and it just totally made me rethink everything I was doing. In it, he assembled a model of the Southwest that still is here today. It's been refined, it's been changed slightly, but the basic paleoecology of the Southwest he put forth in that book. And it's not very long, 87 pages. It's kind of a large format, taller than most books. But the pollen diagrams, is everything he did in that were just what really set the stage for that part of his life and moved him on. A lot of us owe our careers to Paul, to the excitement he generated to explore our world, both past and present, and challenged us and gave us the freedom to go out there and explore those ideas. Make sure that you do follow your sun, follow your ideas, follow where you want to go with it. He's missed. We all have said that. We always will. After I retired and moved back to Tucson, I would gather up here quite regularly and have lunch with him while he was still on the hill. And then as his health declined and he stayed more toward his house, I would then go over to his house and we would have a lunch together. And the discussions, as you all note, were just wide-ranging on everything, from something that he had seen on television last night to something he had read or some new papers somebody had sent him. It was always a very enlightened and delightful time. But the pollen years up here were fun. It was a real beehive activity, and it led to a lot of other things that went on to good fruition.
My name is Geoff Spaulding. For those of you who don't know me, I came up here at the final years of the pollen period and actually got my master's thesis in pollen. And in the process, Tom was provoking graduate students, I should say Paul was provoking graduate students to go out and look at Packrat middens. He had seen some papers from Phil Wells at the University of Kansas that announced that the Pleistocene vegetation of the American Southwest was even more different than was thought based on the pollen record. And the first person that he managed to provoke into this new line of research was Tom Van Devender. And Tom took after it like a dog with a bone and just went charging after it and went to all these different mountain ranges and came back with all these different samples. And as a younger graduate student, I looked at that, looked at what Paul was doing with this new line of research, and I said, that's absolutely wonderful. And that opened a new era of paleoecological research on Tumamoc Hill. Not to say that the old era closed, it just opened into a new era. And there was another core of discovery, as Paul used to call us. And there was Tom Van Devender, and there was Bob Thompson, and there was Jim Mead. And in the hubris of our youth, we looked at the map of the American West. And you take the Sonoran Desert, Tom, I'll take the Mojave. Bob Thompson will take the Great Basin. We'll all go out there and we'll gather Packrat middens and bring them back and argue about Pleistocene paleoecology and extinctions and what it all meant, what the seasonality of precipitation at various times in the past was. It was a truly remarkable time. And sometimes Paul would engage in those discussions, sometimes Paul would just sit there and smile at us. And he knew more than we did, and he always knew more than we did. And it was such a remarkable atmosphere. And that era again closed. I remember at the time in my really limited way of looking at it as a young man, thinking that Paul's spending too much time with environmental education. He's not doing hard science anymore. What's that all about? And it took me a long time to realize that every man has phases in his professional career, and Paul moved from one phase to another phase of his professional career with a grace and a wonder that was really, truly lovely to see. And I think in the end, he taught me more about how to live than even how to do science. And that was quite a blessing. Thank you.
So Gary Haynes is up next. Gary?
Actually, I'm a stand-in for Jim Mead, who can't be here today. And I'm supposed to tell you about Overkill, which I think Jim could have done very well. I'm an archaeologist, and I wasn't a student of Paul's, but I did visit him from time to time. And as I said earlier, I met him first at a meeting in 1985, I think it was, where he asked the audience, there was maybe 300 people sitting, and anybody here believe in overkill? Maybe 3 people sort of hesitantly raised their hands so nobody else could see them. Being an archaeologist, I had been thoroughly indoctrinated with the idea that human beings could not possibly have had anything to do with the extinction of so many big animals in all those land masses and islands of the world. We were coming, most of us I think, were coming from a 4 subfield anthropology department, So this is what we had to believe, that it had to be climate change. And I went to Africa in 1982 for the first time to look at elephants dying from natural causes, and after a while it became clear to me that maybe he's right after all, that maybe Overkill does a better job of explaining things that climate change just cannot really keep up with. And it did become clear, I think, over the years, not just talking to him, but just thinking it through after reading what he had to say, that there is only one thing that really correlates well with the disappearance of so many species of big land mammals wherever it happened. In Australia, in North and South America, Madagascar, other islands, New Zealand, it's the appearance of Homo sapiens. And to Paul, that was the bottom line. It was just nothing else, as he said at one of those television documentaries. There's nothing else to see in prehistory except that correlation. And that sank in with me. And I think over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a sort of a revival, at least of interest, in Overkill amongst archaeologists. Many paleontologists and geologists seem to have taken it for granted that this is a fairly good theory that does a better job than environmental change for explaining how big species disappeared. But it has sunk in with me anyway, and I think it might have sunk in with many other archaeologists at this point who might still be reluctant to admit it, that it is possible that human beings, when they enter a new landmass, just don't have a clue as to how to maintain sustainability until they've been there for a while. So anyway, Paul had a major influence on my career and my thinking, and he still will from now on. Thank you.
Alberto Burquez. Alberto? Seems to be about right.
Thank you. Well, I have notes. I am supposed to speak about Paul's project, 20-year or more project on the exploration and the rewriting of the Rio Mayo plans. A major work that involved rewriting Howard's Colty entries, book, doubling the number of species, exploring great expanses of the Sierra Madre and the lowlands in southern Sonora and Chihuahua. And I met Paul in a meeting. I didn't know who was Paul. Paul was standing outside the building under the canopy of a very old calabash tree. They're big tropical trees, Crescentia lata. The tree was large, was full of very large gourds, calabashes, that are very, very hard. And there were strange maroon flowers arising directly from the stem. And of course, to show my vast knowledge, I started giving him a lecture on the dispersal of calabash trees and the long gone dispersal agents of many tropical fruits. Grinning, the blue-eyed mammoth-sized man asserted and showed great enthusiasm about my knowledge and my trips with Daniel Jansen into the tropical forest. I knew Dan Jansen. And he said, I also knew Dan. He added that the forests and savannas of America were populated until recently by all sorts of large animals. That studying this long-gone ecosystem was the key to understanding the plight posed by the actual mass extinction. Shortly later, I discovered my embarrassing mistake, of course. I chatted to the very man that moved our perception of ecological climate from an understanding of decadal changes at the most into proposing theories going back thousands of years and evoking ghosts of the ecological past. My interaction with Paul was restricted to his later years. I wish I had known him from the beginning. And his influence was determinant in steering my eyes from the microcosm of hummingbirds and plant reproduction into looking at the scale of sierras, expansive deserts, and grasslands, secret mountain forests, and deep time. When Paul wrote his first paper, I was 3. By the time I met him, he knew vastly more about Mexico than me and most Mexicans. He was in love with the campesinos and rural Mexican lifestyle. He enjoyed camping and preparing a basic breakfast out of his tent. He loved the outstanding diversity of Mexican countryside and was happy to share his knowledge without reserves. Paul one day called my office, inviting me to go with him to Alamos, to the Cajon del Cuchujaque, a box canyon deep into the tropical forest of southern Sonora. He came in his great blue Chevy pickup, and I joined him in El Paloma, my white pickup. We went along with Hela and my sons on a great expedition, and we reached Alamos. Early next day we left. Stephanie Mayer was trailing behind us with my children, Hela and me riding along with Paul. Along the way, Paul was pointing at large bombax palmariae trees, orchiotes, palm groves, many other amazing plants and plant communities. We finally arrived to the Cajon. Paul pulled the box very quickly. As soon as we parked, he went down, pulled the box from the back of the pickup, started a pull float. The terrain is very rough at the Cajon. Stood there, held his cane, with the other hand started blowing the float, and said, "Alberto, aren't you going to have your swimming suit?" So I obliged, and by the time I was just changing, Paul was already into the river. I stood in amazement. I followed him swimming into the canyon. Above were dark stones in shadows, a very long, narrow strip of blue sky. It's very, very high, the walls. We were just going in these green waters. Octopus agaves were hanging from the walls, frangipanis. And then he asked me, far from the pool, now well deep into the canyon, he asked me, how do you reckon the floats go up? Just pointing at some fig trees, dead fig trees, branches, holding debris high up in the canyon. And was the end of the rainy season, but still there were rain, so we were just risking being taken by the floods there. Paul just calmed me and said, "Don't worry, we are going back." We swam back. We finally reached the pool. He asked me to hold in his cane. The float finally expired. He got the cane with neck-deep water and came out, and I was almost drowning at that time. And that was my experience with Paul. Really, was a great meeting. It was great meeting him. He was a great mentor, and we owe very much to him. And to Mary Kay, that always welcomed us at the Armory Park house, feed us, and made very acute and nice remarks about the errors in our discussions.
Okay, we do have a Tom Van Devender sighting. So.
Well, what a wonderful group of people to be here. I'm sorry we're late, but and I understand Geoff Spaulding's already covered the Packrat Middens a bit here. But I was a wild, young, red-haired herpetologist that came from Texas. I followed another herpetologist here, but between Charles Lowe and Paul Martin, they made me a scientist. They broadened my horizons in ways that you just couldn't believe. First, Mo was a great ecologist, and I learned from him. But then I took Paul Martin's class of natural history of the Southwest. And from him, he had us learn the 100 common woody plants. And that began my career as a botanist, and that's mostly what I am these days. But in that course, he also introduced us to Packrat Middens. And that with Kevin Moody and myself, we went out and began to study Packrat Middens. And that led to the whole bevy of Tumamoc Hill PhDs and students that sort of learned all of the secrets of the deserts of the Southwest. That opened an entire new discipline, Paul's quiet way. He never studied middens himself, but he inspired all of us to do that. So every day I go in the field, Paul Martin's with me. I mean, it's that kind of thing. But the other thing that's probably not, I don't know if it's been mentioned or not, but Paul was a great adventurer, a wanderer. He liked to go places. And his old GMC pickup truck, he went everywhere. But part of that early group, and Wally Wolfenden did a great cartoon. He called us the Tropical Honkies Expeditionary Force. and that was the bunch of people that would go, and it was Martha Ames and her husband, Fred Wiseman, and a whole bunch of us, and we went to Alamos, we went lots of places. But that inspired Muffin to, when she went to the Desert Museum, she started the special events program, and that led to recreating those sort of field trips for the public, for other people. And all of us have sort of been inspired by that spirit of adventure that came from Paul Martin directly. And so to this day, we're still going in the field in those sort of expeditions. And I didn't know what a natural historian was until I met Paul. He started off as a bird watcher as a youth in Pennsylvania, and he was a great scientist, but he was also a great natural historian. And so every time we go in the field, we look at all plants and animals, and it's partly due to him. He also, beginning in the late 1980s, he was inspired to retrace Howard Gentry's footsteps in the Rio Mayo region. And partly that was just his spirit of adventure. He wanted to go to wild places. But to do that, he said, well, we'll redo the Rio Mayo flora. And 10 years later, he'd inspired enough people that the book came out. And it's a landmark flora for northwestern Mexico. It's a very important book. And so the last 3 years, I have a new position with Sky Island Alliance, and I'm leading something called the Madrayan Archipelago Biodiversity Assessment. And my main job is to lead expeditions to Mexico, to go to wild places, take groups of 20 to 40 people to make observations, and probably most important, to get that synergism that Paul so well inspired. We all get together and everybody contributes things, and the synergism of the group is really more important. So Paul's legacy is not only in science, not only in secrets of the past, but it's also in natural history and exploring the Sierra Madre and wild places. So, and my wife Anna Lily and I, we have, Mary Kay gave us a bit of his ashes, and we've been leaving little bits of ashes wrapped in a Kino fig leaf in various places. So Paul's now visited the Rio Aros and the Northern Jaguar Reserve, the Sierra de Bacadehuachi, the Malpais lava flows near Tepache, Sonora, and half a dozen other places. So his spirit is still with us. So thank you.
Okay, the last person I know of on the list for the formal presentations is David Burney. Did I get that right, David?
You get it right.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Mary Kay, and everybody for organizing this. This really is a great experience for all of us. Truly, truly a memorable time. Josh Dunlin was going to speak today about Paul's last and perhaps most controversial idea. But I was involved in that idea well before Josh came along as a graduate student, and so I was happy to fill in. You know, I asked Paul one time years ago, I said, you know, how do you handle always having so many people wanting to argue with you? I said, doesn't that bother you a little bit that your ideas have this kind of edge to them? And he says, Burney, you know, you need to realize, if you look at the history of science, science never makes any progress unless somebody's willing to paint a target on himself. That's exactly what Paul did, and I feel like we all learned a lot from that. And when you think about his ideas about interpretation of pollen diagrams or new ways to use Packrat middens or even old animal dung, you know, Paul has, I think, had the world's largest collection of animal shit, anybody on Earth, or his ideas on the Pleistocene overkill. All of this reminds me of something that a German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said about the acceptance of new ideas. He says ideas that are really worthwhile, that really change things, go through 3 stages. Think about Paul now in this regard. First stage, everybody says it's crazy. In the second stage, it's violently opposed, probably illegal. In the third stage, they all knew it all along. Think about it now. How many of Paul's crazy ideas now are just accepted? Everybody knew them all along. And so I'm here to talk about, in a way, his last hurrah, his last crazy idea, and one that maybe for many people hasn't gotten to that third stage of Schopenhauer's yet. And that's the Pleistocene Rewilding idea, or as Tim Carroll called it, the Pleistocene Rewilding Gambit. And I think a good sense of the word gambit. Gambit used as a kind of strategy in a chess game to move something along. You know, Paul and I got to talking about this early on because Light and I had lived in Africa for many years. We had studied Pleistocene megafauna, still alive, that is the cheetah, and how it interacts with humans in this day and age. And so whenever Paul and I got together, talk went quickly to big animals still alive, and what was the relation between them and the ones that are gone. And so you can see how this rewilding thing started to unfold. You know, I hope that at some point that there will be a complete collection of Paul's essays, including his very obscure essays. And normally I don't have notes, but I had to bring it because some of these are so obscure I was afraid I wouldn't remember the titles. But I want to mention the titles of the stages in this idea for him. And I went back, and I think the first time that he fully articulated this idea in a really elegant way was in 1992 in a really a now extinct journal called Wild Earth, which is kind of a radical environmentalism journal. In 1992, he published a little essay, which was a wonderful, perfectly written essay called "The Last Entire Earth." And that was a quote directly from Henry David Thoreau, somebody that I think was really one of the people that inspired him the most. The idea that the world we live in is this damaged fragment of the world that Paul could imagine so vividly in his mind. And then in 1995, he moved it on a little farther with another kind of obscure essay called "Thinking Like a Canyon." Again, touching on one of his heroes, Aldo Leopold, who wrote about the idea of thinking like a mountain in relation to the wolf and how it has helped protect mountains from erosion. But his twist on it was, of course, the canyon is an erosion feature. And there was all this argument at the time about wild burros and mustangs, and he was, of course, one of those rare voices that was sticking up for keeping them around the Grand Canyon. And then in 1999, after a meeting a couple of years before that in New York at the American Museum, where Paul and I got into a big discussion about how can we move this discussion along about Pleistocene rewilding. He and I co-authored an article with a really, I think, sort of provocative title, which was "Bring Back the Elephants." This was the first point at which, as far as I know, that Paul was able to actually generate hate mail we got some rather nasty letters about this whole idea that even with a big electric fence around it, the whole idea of bringing elephants back to North America in any sort of way was some sort of truly radical idea. So in 2001, in Hilo, of all places, on the Big Island of Hawaii, I organized a little session to talk about in what ways have studies of the past actually sort of fertilized our thinking in conservation. And of course this idea came very much to the front, and Paul gave a wonderful talk at this meeting and then visited us on Kauai and crawled into this cave that we work on there, Makawai Cave. And there was no turning back. From that point on, we were all really committed to this idea. Let's talk about this any place that we can. And so the next year in that Wild Earth, shortly before the magazine went extinct, maybe we had something to do with that, I'm not sure, because it generated some more hate mail. We co-authored an article with Dave Stedman called Evolution's Second Chance. The whole idea that maybe we can put things back on track to some degree through this use of this rewilding idea, one of Paul's most radical ideas. So it all came to a head in 2004 at Ted Turner's Ladder Ranch, in that place with the wonderful name Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, which I thought was really an appropriate and ironic name for a meeting where a group of us got together. And this was organized by Josh Dunlin, a graduate student who was bold enough to stick his neck out and make this sort of the center of his research. And we got a group of people together there at Ted Turner's place, in the midst of a lot of megafauna, of course, which was somewhat rewilded. Ted Turner has, I think, 30,000 bison, something like that, and he was releasing wolves on the property to the consternation of his neighbors. And this was the point at which we decided, okay, this idea's time has come. And as somebody said, never underestimate the power of an idea whose time has come. And we wound up with a little article in Nature, of all places, about this, and there was something like 3,000 letters that came in as a result of that. There were even some death threats, and one of my favorite things to come out of this, and I actually quoted it in full in a book I published last year called Back to the Future in the Caves of Kauai. One of these property rights kind of right-wing blogs really saying that the idea of bringing these animals back is just another way of depriving people of their property rights. And saying, you know, imagine if your children have to go to the school bus in the morning with lions roaming around. So a little over a year after that, of course, his book, Twilight of the Mammoths, came out. And I certainly hope you've all read it. If you haven't, you really should read it, because that in some ways was his swan song, one of his most beautiful pieces of writing, and I think a true legacy of this entire wonderful life of his. And I just wanted to finish by saying that although I thought for years and years that Paul had more or less invented this idea, Pleistocene Rewilding, I discovered a letter by accident last year in Mauritius, of all places, written by Charles Darwin in 1874, a letter to the governor of Mauritius saying, you know, until a short time ago, less than a century, there were giant tortoises all over these islands in the western Indian Ocean. Now they only survive on Aldabra, and soon people will probably wipe them out there too. You should send a ship forthwith to the island of Aldabra, load up these tortoises, and spread them throughout the islands of the Indian Ocean. They actually did that, and now there are thousands of giant tortoises in the Seychelles and Mauritius, Rodrigue, and whether we're talking about the Francois Legat Giant Tortoise and Cave Reserve on Rodrigue, or the Pleistocene Park in Siberia, Ted Turner's Ladder Ranch, or even our own little project of rewilding on Kauai with rare plants, the Makawai Cave Reserve. This idea has now climbed over the fence or scratched under, and it's out there. And if it's a bad idea, well, let's give it time. I think Schopenhauer's probably right. pretty soon we will all have known this all along. Thank you very much.
I was on the list for being able to do an audio video, but we can't do that here. So if I could have 2 minutes to do a hymn, Bring Back the Mammoths, which Paul Martin, Larry Agenbrod, and I did in 1998 at the Mammoth Site in South Dakota. Anybody into that?
Yeah, go on.
Hymn?
I'll hold you for 2 minutes though, okay? Here we go.
My name is Connie Barlow, and Paul Martin wrote the foreword to my 2001 book, The Ghosts of Evolution, based on his Dan Jansen paper, 1982, Neotropical Anachronisms, The Fruits, the Gomphotheres. How many of you are familiar with that 1982? Yeah, let's hear it for the Gomphotheres. Okay, so Paul and I have worked together for a while, and in 1998, there was a program. How many of you have been to the Mammoth Site in South Dakota? Okay, let's hear it for the mammoths. Yeah. Okay. So, in 1998, there was a celebration going on at the Mammoth Site in South Dakota, and Paul gave me a call because we'd been involved in this rewilding idea for a while, and he said, Connie, how would you like to lead a memorial service there where you impersonate your favorite plant that's missing the elephants, honey locust? And I said, sure, I'll do that. And so we decided that we would have a memorial service. We did it, and I wrote this hymn, which goes to a tune that all of you know. It's to the tune Let It Be, and it's called Bring Back the Elephants. Okay. So just join in. When we look around North America, there is something that it lacks. It's the mighty elephant.
Bring 'em back.
O'er this continent they once did roam. Plains and forests all are home. Bring back the elephant. Bring 'em back.
Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back. Bring back the elephants, bring 'em back.
Though we find ourselves in a time of trouble, the past can help us shape our dreams. Dreaming of the future, let us dream. What vision will help move us toward a beautiful and gentle track? Bring back the elephants, bring 'em back.
Bring 'em back, bring 'em back. Bring 'em back, bring 'em back. Bring back the elephants, bring 'em back.
Many times in 20 million years, the elephants have journeyed here. From lands of the old world they did come. A capacity to change their act is an evolutionary fact. We owe them a future. Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back.
Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back. Bring 'em back. Bring back the elephants, bring 'em back. Bring 'em back, bring 'em back. Bring them back, bring them back. Bring back the elephants, bring 'em back.
Oh, Paul's listening.
Now there's more coffee. Hold up those chairs, get them out of the way, wander around, talk to each other, do your thing.
Cool.
Done.
Thanks.